An infertile giant mountain man won an 18-year-old in a poker game, and what he did next shocked everyone. The saloon air is thick with smoke, cards slap the table, and boots stomp as laughter fills the night. A towering man, scarred, silent, feared, pushes forward his last hand. When the game ends, the prize shoved his way isn't gold or cattle. It's a trembling young girl. The crowd roars. They expect him to claim her. But instead, he does something no one saw coming. Outside, the church bell tolls. Whispers spread down every dusty street. The barren giant's got himself a bride. But on the frozen trail, danger closes in. Armed men ride, carrying papers that say she belongs to them. A sheriff's badge gleams in the firelight, ready to drag her away. What hidden debts bind her fate? What buried pain drives him to fight? And when the law itself stands against them, will mercy be strong enough to triumph over greed? In a land where justice is bought and sold, can one broken giant protect the innocent and find redemption before it's too late? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The oil lamps cast flickering shadows across the crowded saloon as tobacco smoke hung thick in the air. Outside, the autumn wind whistled through the streets of Leadville, but inside the establishment, the press of bodies and burning wood stove kept the chill at bay. The usual din of conversation had hushed to whispers as men gathered around the high-stakes poker table, their eyes fixed on the growing pile of coins and banknotes at its center. Joseph Hale sat uncomfortably in his chair, which creaked beneath his massive frame. His weathered hands, scarred from years of working trap lines in the high country, held his cards close. He hadn't wanted to join this game. The mountain man preferred the quiet solitude of his cabin to the noisy saloon, but the insistent coaxing of the other players had worn him down. "Come on, mountain man," they'd said. "Surely you've got something better to do with that fur money than hide it away in your cabin." Now here he sat, his broad shoulders hunched beneath his wool coat, trying to ignore the way the other men drew back slightly whenever he shifted in his seat. Joseph had grown used to that reaction. At 6'4", with a face marked by an old bear's claws and hands like sledgehammers, he knew his appearance frightened people. But those who knew him understood that his size masked a gentle nature. The current hand had drawn quite a crowd. $500 lay in the pot, more money than most miners would see in 6 months of backbreaking work. Most of the players had already folded, leaving only Joseph and Red McCullough, a horse trader known more for his drinking than his business sense. Red's bloodshot eyes darted between his cards and the pot. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. "I'm out of cash," he slurred, "but I've got something better to wager." Joseph's stomach tightened. He'd seen that desperate look before, and it never led anywhere good. "The hand's rich enough," he said quietly, hoping to end things there. But Red wouldn't be deterred. He turned and gestured to a corner where a young woman sat alone, her plain dress and shawl marking her as out of place among the painted saloon girls. "I'm wagering my ward there. Kira Dawson. She's 18, healthy, and would make a fine wife for any man." The girl's head snapped up, her face draining of color. Joseph saw fear flash in her eyes before she lowered them to her lap again, her hands clenched in her skirts. A roar of laughter went up from the crowd. "There's a prize for you, Hale," someone shouted. "Maybe you'll have better luck getting children on this one than your last wife." Joseph's jaw clenched at the cruel jab, but he kept his voice steady. "A person ain't property to be wagered, McCullough." "She's my legal ward," Red insisted, his words slurring together. "Her pa left her in my care before he died, and I can do with her as I please." "Are you accepting the bet or not?" Joseph looked again at the girl, Kira. She sat perfectly still, like a rabbit trying to avoid a predator's notice, but he could see her trembling. The thought of this child being traded like cattle turned his stomach, but if he refused the bet, what then? Red would likely just find another player willing to accept, someone who might not have any qualms about treating her poorly. The crowd pressed closer, their breath hot with whiskey and anticipation. "Take the bet, Hale. Show us what you've got." The shouts echoed off the sawdust-covered floor. With a heavy heart, Joseph nodded once. I accept. Red slapped his cards down triumphantly. 3 kings. The crowd leaned in as Joseph slowly laid out his hand. One by one, the cards fell. Ace of hearts, ace of clubs, ace of diamonds, ace of spades, and a king of hearts. Silence fell over the saloon. Then someone whistled low. 4 aces. Ain't seen that in a month of Sundays. Red's face turned as red as his name as he staggered to his feet. No, you cheated. You must have. Sit down, Red, the bartender called out. Everyone here saw it was a fair hand. Pay your debt. 2 miners grabbed Kira's arms and hauled her to her feet. She didn't struggle as they pushed her toward the table, but Joseph could see tears glinting in her eyes. Here's your prize, Mountain Man, one of the miners laughed, shoving her forward. Though I reckon she won't do you much good, seeing as how you couldn't even get a child on your first wife. More cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Joseph stood slowly, drawing himself up to his full height. The laughter died away as he towered over them all, his shadow falling across the table like a mountain shade. The game is done, he said quietly, but his voice carried to every corner of the suddenly silent room. He gathered the money from the pot with one hand while keeping his other near the pistol at his hip. Not threatening, but ready. Then, he turned to Kira, who stood trembling beside the table. Miss Dawson, he said formally, keeping his voice gentle despite the anger churning in his gut. I don't hold you to any obligation. You're free to go where you please. But if you need a safe place to stay, my cabin has a spare room. You'd be welcome to it until you decide what you want to do. Kira looked up at him, really meeting his eyes for the first time. Joseph saw intelligence there, and fear, but also a flash of hope. She glanced at Red, who had slumped back in his chair, already reaching for another whiskey bottle. I would be grateful for that offer, Mr. Hale, she said softly, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. Joseph nodded and reached for his coat, which hung on the back of his chair. As he did so, one of the miners called out, Better watch yourself, girl. They say he's part bear, living up there alone in them mountains. That's enough, Joseph growled, and something in his tone made even the drunkest troublemakers step back. He draped his coat over Kira's shoulders, noticing how she flinched slightly at his proximity, before accepting the warmth of the heavy wool. The coat swallowed her small frame, making her look even younger and more vulnerable. My horse is outside, he said quietly. We can ride to the general store first, get you whatever supplies you need. Kira nodded, clutching the coat around her shoulders. As they made their way to the door, the crowd parted before them, like water around a boulder. Joseph kept his body between Kira and the other men, shielding her from their stares and whispered comments. The night air hit them like a slap as they stepped outside. The moon hung low over the mountains, casting long shadows across the muddy street. Joseph's horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently at the hitching post where he'd left it hours ago. I never meant to own another person, Joseph said suddenly, feeling the need to explain himself. I just couldn't stand by and let. I understand, Kira interrupted softly. And I'm grateful. Red's been different since my father died, drinking more, gambling away everything we had. She hugged herself tighter in his coat. I've been afraid of what he might do. Joseph nodded, relief easing some of the tension in his shoulders. He'd made the right choice, even if it meant enduring more whispers and jokes about his past, his inability to father children, his solitary life in the mountains. The horse nickered softly as they approached. Joseph helped Kira mount first, then swung up behind her, careful to maintain a respectful distance despite the close quarters of the saddle. As they rode toward the general store, the warm lights of the saloon fading behind them, Joseph could feel Kira gradually relaxing, her rigid posture softening slightly. The night was cold, but clear, with stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust. Ahead, the mountains loomed dark and familiar, promising the peace and solitude Joseph had grown to love. He didn't know exactly what would come of this strange turn of events, but he knew one thing for certain. He'd done what needed doing. Whatever happened next, he would make sure this young woman had the safety and respect she deserved, even if it meant opening up his solitary life to change. The horses' hooves clocked steadily against the packed earth as they made their way down the main street, the sound echoing off the false fronts of the buildings. A few people still moved about their business, but none paid them much mind. Just another rider and his passenger heading out into the night. But Joseph knew this was more than a simple journey home. For both him and Kira, it was the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected when the sun rose that morning. As they approached the general store, its windows still glowing with lamplight despite the late hour, Joseph silently promised himself that he would do right by this unexpected twist of fate. The mountains waited ahead, solid and unchanging, while behind them, the whispers and laughter of the saloon faded into the autumn night. The future was uncertain, but for now, they had a direction to ride toward. And sometimes, Joseph knew that was enough to begin with. The saloon erupted into chaos as Red slumped in his chair, defeated. Men crowded around the table, their boots scuffing against the sawdust floor, eager to see what would happen next. The air grew thick with tobacco smoke and the sharp bite of whiskey. "Well, go on then, Hale," someone shouted. "Claim your winnings." Joseph remained seated, his large hands resting flat on the table. His eyes found Kira, who stood trembling between the two miners who'd grabbed her earlier. Her head was bowed, dark hair falling forward to hide her face. But he could see how she gripped her worn shawl with white-knuckled fingers. The crowd grew restless. A bottle crashed somewhere in the back of the room. "What's the matter, mountain man?" another voice called out. "Prize not pretty enough for you." Joseph pushed his chair back slowly, the wooden legs scraping against the floor. As he rose to his full height, the men nearest him took an instinctive step backward. In the lamplight, his shadow stretched across the table, like a bear rising from its den. "No child," he said, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the room, "should ever be treated as property." He turned to face Kira directly. "Miss Dawson, you're free to walk away. I won't hold you to any man's foolish wager." A heavy silence fell over the saloon. Even the piano player stopped his tinny tune. Kira lifted her head slowly, her eyes wide with disbelief. The quiet shattered as someone in the back burst into laughter. "Listen to him. The Baron Giant's got himself a conscience." More voices joined in, cruel and mocking. "Ain't that sweet? Too bad he couldn't give his first wife a baby. Maybe she wouldn't have run off. Probably afraid this one would leave him too." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he kept his eyes on Kira. He'd endured worse taunts in his years of solitude. The girl's safety mattered more than their petty jabs. To everyone's surprise, Kira didn't run. Instead, she pulled free from the miner's loosened grip and crossed to Joseph's side. Her small hand caught his arm, trembling, but determined. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the noise of the saloon. "I have no one left. Nowhere else to go." Her fingers tightened on his sleeve. "Red gambled away everything my father left me. The boarding house won't take me without payment." Joseph felt the weight of every eye in the room upon them. His instincts, honed by years of avoiding trouble, told him to walk away. A man living alone in the mountains couldn't afford scandal or gossip. But as he looked down at Kira's desperate face, he knew he couldn't abandon her to whatever fate awaited in Leadville's shadows. "Looks like she's made her choice," like someone shouted, "taking the mountain man over Red's whiskey breath. Better watch out, girl. They say he's part grizzly." Joseph reached for his coat, which hung on a peg near the table. The heavy wool still carried the scent of pine and wood smoke from his cabin. Without a word, he draped it around Kira's shoulders. The coat swallowed her small frame, but she clutched it gratefully. "You may walk with me," he said quietly, "until you find somewhere safe." He gathered the money from the pot, tucking it securely in his vest pocket. The coins clinked softly, a reminder of how this strange situation had begun. The crowd parted as Joseph moved toward the door, Kira staying close to his side. The warmth of her presence felt foreign after so many years alone. Behind them, the whispers and speculation grew like wildfire. $10 says she don't last a week in them mountain. Reckon the bearman's finally found himself a mate. Poor girl's desperate if she's willing to take up with the likes of him. Joseph pushed open the heavy wooden door and the crisp night air rushed in to chase away the saloon's stale heat. The street lay quiet under a scatter of stars, with only a few windows still glowing along the boardwalk. In the distance, the mountains rose black against the sky, familiar and imposing. As they stepped outside, Joseph felt a change in the wind. It carried more than just the usual bite of approaching winter. Years of reading weather signs had taught him to recognize when a storm was brewing, and this night felt heavy with possibility and danger. Kira huddled deeper into his coat, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. "Thank you," she said softly. "I know this must be difficult for you." Joseph glanced down at her, noting how young and vulnerable she looked in the moonlight. "No decent man could have done differently," he replied, his voice gruff but gentle. A burst of laughter spilled out from the saloon as someone opened the door behind them. Joseph instinctively moved to shield Kira from view, his broad shoulders blocking the light and noise. "We should move on," he said. "The general store stays open late on poker nights. We can get you some supplies before heading to my cabin." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "You understand this isn't... that is, I'm offering... shelter. Nothing more." Kira nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I wouldn't expect, I know you're only being kind." More voices approached the saloon door. Joseph gestured toward the darker end of the street where his horse waited. "This way. We'll avoid the main road." As they walked, their boots quiet on the packed earth, Joseph felt the weight of what he'd done settling around his shoulders. He'd spent years building a life of solitude, finding peace in the silence of his mountain home. Now, with one decision, he'd invited chaos back into his world. But watching Kira walk beside him, her head held high despite her fear, he knew he couldn't have chosen differently. His wife's death had left him wary of connecting with others, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to abandon someone in need. Whatever storm was coming, he would weather it as he had weathered all others, with quiet strength and stubborn determination. The night wrapped around them like a blanket as they made their way through the sleeping town. Behind them, the saloon continued to buzz with speculation and gossip, but its noise grew fainter with each step. Ahead lay uncertainty, but also the promise of safety and respect, something both of them had lacked for far too long. Dawn broke over Leadville in streaks of pale gold, the early light catching on frost-rimmed windows and weathered storefronts. Joseph stood in the stable yard, methodically checking the straps on his pack horse while his trusted mule waited patiently nearby. The morning air was sharp with cold, carrying the scent of pine from the mountains that loomed ahead. Kira emerged from the general store carrying a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. She'd changed into the clothes they'd purchased the night before, a sturdy wool dress, thick stockings, and boots that nearly fit. Her old shawl was replaced by a proper coat, though it hung loose on her thin frame. "I got the last of the supplies you listed, Mr. Hale," she said, holding up the package. "The shopkeeper's wife helped me find a warm blanket, too." Joseph nodded, taking the bundle and securing it to the pack horse with practiced movements. "Good. You'll need it where we're headed." He paused, his large hands stilling on the leather straps. "There's still time to change your mind. The stage to Denver leaves at noon." Kira's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "I can't stay in town, sir. Red has friends here. They'd find me, claim me somehow. I'd rather take my chances in the mountains." "The mountains ain't kind to the unprepared," Joseph warned, though he recognized the truth in her words. Towns like Leadville held their own dangers for young women alone. "Then I'll learn," Kira said simply. "I'm stronger than I look." Joseph studied her for a long moment, then turned to adjust the mule's bridle. "Very well. But you'll need to do exactly as I say. The trail's no place for argument." As they led the animals onto the main street, windows began opening in the surrounding buildings. Early risers paused in their morning routines to stare. Joseph felt their eyes like physical weight on his shoulders, heard the whispers start like rustling leaves. "Lord above, he's really taking herself. Poor thing tied to that giant. Heard he won her fair and square. Shameful, a girl that young." A group of women stood gossiping outside the millinery shop, their voices carrying clearly in the morning air. "Just like his first wife," one said, shaking her head. "Mark my words, this one won't last either. No woman can survive up there with him barren as he is." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, his strides long and purposeful. Behind him, Kira hurried to keep pace, her new boots clicking on the packed earth. When they reached the horse he'd borrowed for her, a steady bay mare from the livery, Joseph turned to face Kira. "Ever ridden before?" She shook her head. "Just in a wagon with my father." Without comment, Joseph cupped his hands to make a step. Kira placed her boot in his palms, and he lifted her easily onto the horse's back. The mare shifted slightly, but remained calm. Keep your back straight, he instructed, adjusting her grip on the reins. Heels down, hands steady. Don't pull too hard on her mouth. His voice was gruff but patient as he demonstrated the basics of steering and stopping. They left town heading north, the sun climbing higher behind them. Joseph led them off the main road early, taking a less traveled trail that wound through stands of aspen. The tree's leaves had turned golden, trembling in the morning breeze like coins catching light. As the ground began to rise, Joseph called back instructions. Stay close to my mule's tail. He knows the way, and the mare will follow. Save your strength. We've got a long climb ahead. The morning passed in steady progress. Joseph kept their pace deliberate, watching how Kira handled the increasing elevation. She remained quiet, focused on staying mounted, though he noticed her white-knuckled grip on the saddle horn. By midday, they'd climbed high enough to look back over the valley. Leadville lay below like a child's toy town, smoke rising straight from chimneys in the still air. Joseph called a halt near a creek, helping Kira dismount. Her legs trembled as they hit the ground. We'll rest here, he said, leading the animals to water. Get your bearings back. Kira nodded gratefully, sinking onto a sun-warmed rock. After a few minutes, she stood and began gathering twigs and smaller branches. Joseph watched as she arranged the wood carefully, just as he'd shown her the night before at the general store. Her hands were steady now as she struck the match, feeding the tiny flame until it caught the kindling. Soon, a small fire crackled cheerfully. I'll fetch water, she said, reaching for the tin pot in their supplies. For coffee, if you'd like some. Joseph grunted agreement, surprised at her initiative. He busied himself with the horses while she filled the pot at the creek and set it to boil over the flames. The familiar routine of checking hooves and adjusting loads helped settle his unease at having company after so long alone. When the coffee was ready, Kira poured it carefully into 2 tin cups, offering one to Joseph. Thank you, she said quietly, for teaching me about the fire. And the riding. I know I'm a burden, but I'll learn quickly. I promise. Joseph accepted the cup but didn't reply. The coffee was strong and hot, better than he'd expected. They ate a simple meal of jerky and hard biscuits, the creek's song filling the silence between them. As the sun began its westward slide, they made camp in a protected hollow near the water. Joseph showed Kira how to brush down the horses, then set about making a lean-to while she built another fire. The girl worked efficiently, without complaint, though he could see fatigue in every movement. Darkness fell early in the shadow of the mountains. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on the rocks behind them. Joseph had just finished checking his rifle when Kira's voice rose softly in song. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound. The familiar hymn floated on the evening air, clear and true despite her weariness. Joseph's hand stilled on the gun barrel as memories washed over him. Sunday mornings in a white-painted church, his wife's voice joining the congregation, the hope they'd shared before grief and whispers drove them to the mountains. That saved a wretch like me. Kira's voice carried no judgment, no hidden barbs. It was simply a song learned at her mother's knee, offered now to the night sky and the listening pines. Joseph sat motionless, something long frozen in his chest beginning to crack like spring ice. I once was lost, but now am found. The last notes faded into the crackling of the fire. Kira pulled her blanket closer, staring into the flames. Joseph remained silent, but he felt the weight of the evening's peace settle around them like a benediction. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with disuse. Get some sleep. We start early tomorrow. Kira nodded, curling up in her blanket near the fire. Soon her breathing deepened into the rhythm of exhausted slumber. Joseph stayed awake, watching the stars wheel overhead through gaps in the trees. The hymn echoed in his mind, stirring memories he'd thought safely buried in the past. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like fallen stars. In the distance, a lone coyote called, its voice rising wild and free in the darkness. Joseph added another log to the flames, his movements careful not to wake his sleeping companion. The night stretched long ahead, full of questions he wasn't ready to answer. The second morning on the trail dawned gray and threatening. Joseph woke early, his experienced eyes reading the heavy clouds that clung to the mountain peaks. The wind had shifted during the night, carrying the sharp bite of approaching snow. We need to move, he told Kira as she stirred from her blankets. Storms coming down from the high country. She nodded, moving quickly to help break camp despite the stiffness in her muscles from yesterday's ride. The horses stamped restlessly, their breath forming white clouds in the chill air. They had barely been riding an hour when the first flakes began to fall, small at first, dancing on the wind, but soon growing thicker. The temperature dropped steadily, and the wind picked up force, driving the snow sideways. Joseph pulled his horse alongside Kira's. "We need shelter," he called over the rising wind. "There's a stand of blue spruce ahead. We'll wait it out there." Kira's face was pale, her lips pressed tight against the cold, but she nodded. Joseph noticed her hands trembling on the reins, though she said nothing of discomfort. The spruce grove provided some protection from the wind. Joseph quickly built a lean-to against the largest tree, using pine boughs to create a rough roof. He got Kira settled inside while he tended to the horses, making sure they were protected by the natural windbreak of the trees. "We should keep moving," Kira insisted, though her voice shook with cold. "I can ride. I'm stronger now." Joseph shook his head. "No use fighting mountain weather, it'll pass when it passes." He busied himself gathering firewood, selecting the driest branches he could find under the trees. But Kira wouldn't rest. While Joseph was occupied with the fire, she began unpacking supplies, organizing their food, checking the horses again. Her movements grew increasingly unsteady, but she pushed on, determined to prove her worth. "Here," she said, offering Joseph some jerky from their provisions. "We should eat while we can." Her face was flushed now, despite the cold, and her eyes seemed too bright. Joseph studied her with growing concern. "Sit down," he ordered. "You're working too hard." "I'm fine," she insisted, but her voice wavered. She took a step forward and suddenly swayed, her legs buckling beneath her. Joseph caught her before she hit the ground. Her skin burned against his hands, and her breathing came in short, sharp gasps. "Fever," he muttered, his heart clenching with old fear. Memories crashed over him, his younger sister, burning with winter sickness, his wife's cousin lost to fever in the harsh mountain winter. He'd seen too many good people claimed by illness in these mountains. Working quickly, Joseph laid out his heavy buffalo robe near the fire. He wrapped Kira in it, adding his own blanket when she continued to shiver. Her eyes were glassy, unfocused, as he propped her head up with his rolled jacket. "Have to keep moving," she mumbled. "They'll find us if we stop too long." Joseph frowned. "Who'll find us?" "Father's creditors," Kira whispered, her voice thin with fever. "Said I was payment for his debts. Been following since Denver. Saw them in Leadville, too." She clutched at Joseph's sleeve with surprising strength. "Please don't let them take me." Cold anger settled in Joseph's chest, different from the panic of moments before. He'd seen such men before, vultures who preyed on the desperate and defenseless. The mockery in the saloon took on new meaning. Those men hadn't just been gambling for sport, they'd been hunting her. "No one's taking you anywhere," he said firmly. "Rest now, I'll keep watch." While Kira drifted in and out of consciousness, Joseph worked steadily. He gathered pine needles from the younger branches, crushing them between his palms to release their sharp scent before dropping them into boiling water. His mother had sworn by pine needle tea for winter ailments, though he hadn't made it in years. The snow continued falling outside their shelter, but Joseph kept the fire burning hot and steady. Every time Kira's shivering intensified, he added more wood, more heat. Her fever seemed to rise with the shadows, and fear gripped him as the day waned. In the deepening darkness, Joseph did something he hadn't done since his wife's death. He prayed. The words came rusty and uncertain at first, more desperate plea than proper prayer. "Lord," he whispered, watching Kira's restless sleep, "I ain't been much for talking to you these past years. Reckon I've been angry too long. But this girl needs help, and I'm not enough on my own. She's just a child, Lord. Don't let her pay for other men's sins." Through the long night, Joseph tended the fire and kept watch. Every hour he coaxed more tea into Kira, supporting her head as she sipped. Sometimes she spoke in her fever, calling for her father or pleading with unseen creditors. Each time, Joseph's quiet voice brought her back to calm. Near midnight, the snow finally stopped. The clouds parted, revealing a sharp crescent moon that turned the new fallen snow to silver. The temperature dropped further, but inside their shelter, the fire held back the worst of the cold. Kira's fever broke just before dawn. Joseph felt the change in her breathing first, then saw her face relax into natural sleep. The burning heat of her skin gradually cooled to normal warmth. When she finally opened her eyes, they were clear and focused. "You stayed up all night," she said softly, noting the dark circles under his eyes. Joseph shrugged, hiding his relief behind gruff practicality. Someone had to tend the fire. He helped her sit up slowly, steadying her when dizziness made her sway. "Why didn't you tell me about the men following you?" Kira looked away, shame coloring her cheeks. "I thought I could handle it alone. I've been running so long." She twisted the edge of the buffalo robe between her fingers. "Father borrowed money from bad men. When he died, they said I was their property now, to sell or keep as they pleased. I've been trying to stay ahead of them, but they always find me." Joseph's hands tightened on the coffee cup he held. "They won't find you up here," he said firmly, "and if they do, they'll wish they hadn't." The morning sun broke over the mountains, setting the snow-covered landscape ablaze with light. Joseph began breaking camp, but he noticed how Kira's hands trembled as she tried to help. Without a word, he took the heavy packs from her, securing them to his own mount. "But those are my things to carry," she protested weakly. "You're still recovering," he said, his tone brooking no argument. "We've got 3 days hard riding ahead. Save your strength." Kira subsided, recognizing the wisdom in his words. As they mounted up, Joseph noticed how she swayed slightly in the saddle, still weak from the fever. He led them at an easier pace than yesterday, taking trails he knew would be gentler on horse and rider alike. The morning passed quietly, broken only by the soft crunch of hooves in new snow and the occasional call of a jay. Joseph kept a closer watch now, scanning the back trail more frequently, though he knew the snow would have covered any tracks below. The men Kira feared might be following, but they'd find the mountain trails held their own dangers for those who didn't know them well. He glanced back at Kira, noting how she pressed on despite her obvious fatigue. Something protective stirred in his chest, something he'd thought long dead after his wife's passing. This girl needed more than just temporary shelter. She needed someone strong enough to stand between her and those who would harm her. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow to diamond dust around them. Joseph adjusted his path slightly, taking them higher into the mountains where he knew the tracking would be harder and the shelter more secure. His cabin lay ahead, and, with it, the promise of safety. But first they had to reach it, and Kira needed to regain her strength. Joseph shifted more of their supplies to his own horse, lightening her load as much as possible. It wasn't much, but it was what he could do for now. The rest would come with time and trust, and the mountains rose around them, ancient and indifferent to human struggles. But Joseph felt something changing in himself, a slow awakening of purpose he'd thought forever lost. He'd asked God for strength to protect this girl. Now he intended to use it. The last rays of sunlight painted the snow-capped peaks in shades of purple and gold as Joseph guided their weary horses up the final stretch of trail. Kira swayed in her saddle, exhaustion evident in every line of her body. The fever had weakened her more than she would admit, but she hadn't complained once during their arduous journey. "Almost there," Joseph called back, his deep voice carrying over the whisper of wind through the pines. "Just beyond that next ridge." As they crested the rise, his cabin came into view, a solid structure of squared logs and stone, nestled against the mountainside like it had grown there naturally. Smoke curled from the stone chimney where he'd left banked coals in the hearth 3 days ago. The sight of it brought relief even to Joseph, who'd made this journey countless times before. He helped Kira dismount, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. "Easy now," he murmured. "Been a long ride." The girl nodded wearily, letting him support her weight as they approached the cabin door. Joseph lifted the latch and ushered her inside, leaving their gear on the porch for now. The horses could wait a few minutes while he got Kira settled. The cabin's interior lay in shadows. Joseph struck a match and lit the old brass lantern that hung by the door, its warm glow chasing away the darkness. Kira blinked, taking in her surroundings with obvious curiosity. It wasn't much, Joseph knew, but it was solid and warm. The stone hearth dominated one wall, flanked by stacked firewood. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center, while shelves lined the walls, laden with preserved foods, tools, and supplies. A ladder led to the sleeping loft above. Everything was simple but well-maintained, speaking of years of careful attention. It's wonderful, Kira breathed, turning in a slow circle. Her eyes lingered on the thick walls, the sturdy door with its heavy bar. So safe. Joseph felt an unexpected surge of pride at her words. He'd built this place with his own hands, shaped it to withstand the mountain winters and provide refuge from storms. Now it would serve as sanctuary for this girl, who'd known too little safety in her young life. "Sit by the fire," he instructed, already moving to stoke the banked coals. "I'll tend the horses and bring in our gear." By the time he returned, arms full of supplies, the fire was crackling merrily. Kira had sunk into one of the chairs, her eyes half closed with exhaustion. Joseph set about preparing a simple stew, adding dried meat and vegetables to the pot with practiced efficiency. The familiar routine of cooking helped settle his thoughts. This situation was far from anything he'd expected when he'd reluctantly joined that poker game in Leadville. Having another person in his carefully ordered space felt strange after so many years of solitude. While the stew simmered, Joseph pulled out 2 wooden bowls and spoons. The movement caught Kira's attention, and she straightened in her chair. "Can I help?" she asked, starting to rise. "Stay put," Joseph said firmly. "You're still getting over that fever. There'll be time enough for helping once you've got your strength back." The girl subsided, though he could see she wasn't entirely happy about it. Good. She had spirit, even if she didn't always show it. That would serve her well up here. They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crack and pop of the fire and the soft clink of spoons against bowls. Joseph watched as color gradually returned to Kira's cheeks. The warm food and safety were already working their magic. When they'd finished eating, Joseph cleared his throat. Time to set things straight between them. "There's something we need to make clear," he began, his voice gentle but firm. "What those men in town assumed, about you being my wife, that's not what this is." Kira looked up quickly, relief evident in her expression. "I know that, Mr. Hale." "Joseph," he corrected, "up here we don't stand much on formality." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're welcome to stay through the winter. I'll protect you, teach you what you need to know to survive in these mountains, but in return you need to follow my guidance. These peaks don't forgive mistakes." She nodded solemnly. "I understand. Come spring, when the pass is clear, you'll be free to choose your own way. If you want to head to Denver or beyond, I'll see you safely there. If you prefer to stay." He shrugged. "Well, we can discuss that when the time comes." "Thank you," Kira said softly, "for everything. I know taking me in causes you trouble." Joseph waved away her concern. "Trouble finds me whether I look for it or not. At least this time it's for a good cause." He stood, gathering their empty bowls. "Now, you'll take the loft. There's a bed made up there. I'll sleep down here by the fire." "But it's your home. I couldn't take your bed," Kira protested. "You're not taking it, I'm giving it to you," Joseph said firmly. "No arguments. You need proper rest to finish healing." He showed her where to find extra blankets, soap, and other necessities, then helped her up the ladder to the loft. The space was simple but clean, with a narrow bed built into the wall and a small window that looked out over the valley. While Kira settled in above, Joseph spread his bedroll near the hearth. Outside, snow had begun falling heavily, the flakes thick and wet against the window panes. By morning, the trail would be completely covered. They were sealed in for the winter, for better or worse, and the girl's soft footsteps moved across the loft boards as she prepared for sleep. Joseph stared into the flames, considering how this unexpected arrangement would test his carefully cultivated solitude. He'd grown used to answering to no one, speaking to no one but God and his horses for months at a time. Now he had charge of a young woman's safety and well-being. "Good night, Joseph," Kira called down softly. "Good night," he replied, surprised by how natural it felt to have another voice in his home. The fire popped and settled, sending sparks up the chimney. Joseph added another log, making sure it would last through the night. The wind picked up outside, driving the snow harder against the walls, but inside all was warm and still. He said his prayers, something he'd started doing again since meeting Kira, then wrapped himself in his blanket. The girl's steady breathing from the loft told him she was already asleep, trusting in the safety his home provided. Joseph closed his eyes, listening to the familiar sounds of his cabin settling around him. Things would be different now, with another person sharing his space. But as he drifted toward sleep, he realized he didn't mind the change as much as he'd expected. The storm outside grew stronger, but the cabin's thick walls held firm against the wind and snow, sheltering its occupants as it had been built to do. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were safe and warm. Two souls, finding refuge in this mountain sanctuary. The morning after their arrival, Joseph woke before dawn, as was his habit. He found Kira already up, trying to rekindle the fire with clumsy movements. The flames had died down overnight, leaving only faintly glowing embers. "Here," he said, making her jump, "let me show you." Joseph knelt beside her at the hearth. With practiced motions, he demonstrated how to arrange the kindling and coax the embers back to life. "The trick is patience," he explained. "Rush it, and you'll smother what fire remains." Kira watched intently, her face serious with concentration. When Joseph stepped back, she tried herself, following his example carefully until a small flame caught and grew. "Good," Joseph said simply. "You'll need to know this. Fire's life up here." Over the next few days, he showed her other essential tasks. The spring lay a short walk from the cabin, clear water bubbling up between rocks. Joseph taught her how to break through the thin ice that formed each night, how to carry the heavy buckets without spilling. "Keep to this path," he instructed. "Even in snow you can follow the markers I've set." He pointed out the blazed trees and stacked stones that would guide her steps. Kira proved an eager student, though her city-bred hands were soft and unused to such work. The morning he taught her to split kindling, she struck her thumb with the hatchet. Joseph saw her bite back tears, but she wouldn't stop until she'd split enough wood to fill the box by the hearth. Later that day, he found her applying snow to her reddened hands. "Let me see," he said gruffly. "It's nothing," she protested, but he took her hands anyway, examining the blisters and bruises. "Wear these next time," he said, retrieving a pair of leather work gloves from a peg. They were far too big for her small hands, but they'd protect her skin until it toughened. While Kira learned the rhythms of cabin life, Joseph maintained his usual routines. Each morning, he checked his trap lines, bringing home rabbit, fox, and occasionally beaver. He taught her how to skin and clean the catches, how to stretch the pelts for curing. "Waste nothing," he explained as he showed her how to render fat for soap and candles. "Winter's long up here. Everything must serve a purpose." Kira absorbed it all, asking questions, making mistakes, but never complaining. Joseph found himself impressed by her resilience, though he kept such thoughts to himself. Best not to grow too attached. Come spring, she'd likely move on to an easier life somewhere else. Still, he couldn't help noticing how she brightened the cabin. She hummed while she worked, arranged dried flowers she'd found in a tin cup, kept things neater than he ever had. The space felt different with her presence, warmer somehow, despite the increasing cold outside. One evening, after a simple supper of rabbit stew and cornbread, Kira broke their usual comfortable silence. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. Joseph looked up from the trap he was mending. "For what?" "For giving me back my dignity." She traced patterns on the wooden table with one finger. "That night in the saloon, those men thought nothing of wagering me like a piece of property. But you." She met his eyes. "You saw me as a person. You gave me choice when others would have stripped it away." Joseph shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He wasn't used to such direct talk about feelings. "Was the right thing to do is all," he muttered. "Still," Kira's voice grew hesitant, "I've wondered, why are you alone up here? Do you have no family of your own?" The question hit him like a physical blow. Joseph's hand stilled on the trap wire. Memories he'd fought to bury rose up sharp and painful. Martha's smile, her belly swollen with hope month after month, year after year, until finally illness took her, leaving him with nothing but an empty cabin and bitter questions. "Some things," he said roughly, "God sees fit to withhold." He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "Need to check the horses before dark." He escaped into the cold evening air, letting it steal the heat from his face. Behind him, through the cabin window, he could see Kira clearing the table, her movements careful and subdued. He hadn't meant to snap at her. The girl was just trying to understand, but those wounds were still too raw, even after all these years. Later that night, after Kira had climbed to her loft bed, Joseph sat alone by the fire. His eyes were drawn to the small shelf where he kept his few books, trail guides, almanacs, and tucked between them, a small leather-bound Bible. It had been Martha's, her name written in faded ink inside the cover. He hadn't opened it since her death. Couldn't bear to see her careful notes in the margins, the pressed flowers she'd kept between its pages. The wind picked up outside, rattling the shutters. From above came the soft sound of Kira humming, an old hymn Joseph recognized from long ago Sundays. Amazing Grace, the same song Martha used to sing while kneading bread or quilting by the fire. Joseph's throat tightened. He'd thought that warmth forever lost, had wrapped himself in solitude like a shield against further pain. But now, listening to Kira's clear voice weaving through the howling wind, something stirred in his chest, an ember of feeling he'd thought long cold. His fingers brushed the Bible's worn spine, but he couldn't quite bring himself to take it down. Not yet. But for the first time in years, he felt the possibility of it, like spring thaw touching frozen ground. The hymn drifted to an end. Joseph added another log to the fire, watching the flames catch and grow. Tomorrow would bring more lessons, more small adjustments as they learned to share this space. For now, he let himself rest in the quiet moment, aware of Kira's peaceful breathing above, the familiar creaking of his cabin settling around them both. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside, unexpected warmth bloomed like the first flowers pushing through winter's last frost. December settled over the mountains like a heavy blanket, each storm adding fresh layers of snow. The drifts grew steadily higher around Joseph's cabin until they reached the windowsills, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and pure white. Inside, however, warmth bloomed in unexpected ways. Joseph spent long hours tracking deer through the deep snow, his experienced eye following their patterns until he could bring down the prey they needed. One particularly cold morning, he returned hauling a young buck across his shoulders, his beard crusted with ice but satisfaction evident in his eyes. Kira met him at the door, already reaching for the knives she'd learned to use. "That'll keep us fed a while," she said, helping him hang the carcass in the lean-to where the meat would stay frozen. "Reckon so," Joseph agreed, watching as she confidently began the process of cleaning and butchering. Her hands moved with growing skill, no longer hesitant as they had been months ago. "You're getting better at that." A small smile touched her lips at the rare praise. Had a good teacher. Together they worked to preserve every useful part of the deer, the meat cut and stored, the hide scraped clean for tanning, even the bones saved for broth. Nothing went to waste in the mountain winter. That evening, rich venison stew bubbled in the iron pot over the fire, filling the cabin with savory aromas. Joseph sat at the rough-hewn table, watching as Kira mended one of his wool shirts. Her neat stitches were nearly invisible, far better than his own clumsy attempts at repair. "Mama always said idle hands were the devil's workshop," Kira said, holding the shirt up to examine her work, "though I doubt she ever imagined I'd be mending a mountain man's clothes." Joseph grunted, but there was no displeasure in it. The cabin had changed since Kira's arrival, small touches that made it feel more like a home than just shelter. Dried herbs hung from the rafters now, their subtle fragrance mixing with wood smoke. The floors were swept clean, the dishes washed and stacked neatly on their shelf. Even his own habits had shifted, taking more care to wipe his boots before entering, keeping his gear properly stored rather than scattered about. When Sunday came, as it did each week, Kira took down the small Bible from its shelf. Joseph tensed, as he always did, but didn't leave the cabin as he had in the early days. Instead, he remained in his chair, pretending to focus on cleaning his rifle while her clear voice filled the room. "The Lord is my shepherd," Kira read, "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." The familiar words stirred something deep in Joseph's chest, memories of Martha sitting in that very spot, reading those same passages. He'd fought against these feelings for so long, walling off his heart against the pain of loss. But Kira's gentle presence had begun to crack those carefully built defenses. Later that evening, after Kira had gone up to her loft bed, Joseph sat alone by the fire. From a pocket of his coat, he drew out a piece of pine wood and his whittling knife. His large hands, more accustomed to rough work, moved with surprising delicacy as he carved. Slowly, a small cross took shape under his blade. The next morning, before Kira came down for breakfast, Joseph placed the finished cross beside her plate. He said nothing about it, busying himself with stoking the fire instead. But he heard her soft intake of breath when she saw it, felt her eyes on him as she traced the smooth wood with gentle fingers. "Thank you," she whispered, and those two words carried more weight than any lengthy speech could have. Their quiet routine might have continued undisturbed, but the outside world had other ideas. Mid-December brought a visiting trapper, Pete Williams, seeking shelter from an approaching storm. Joseph couldn't turn him away. That was not the mountain way. But he misliked the knowing look in the man's eyes when he saw Kira. After supper, while Kira was in the loft, Williams shared the gossip from town. "Folks down there are mighty curious about your situation," he said, warming his hands by the fire. "Some say you've taken yourself a young wife." Joseph's jaw tightened. Folks ought to mind their own business. Church people especially are scandalized, Williams continued, either missing or ignoring Joseph's tension. Parson's wife near fainted dead away when she heard tell of it. Says it ain't proper, a young girl living alone with. That's enough. Joseph's voice was quiet but carried such authority that Williams fell silent mid-sentence. But the damage was done. Later that night, Joseph found Kira sitting by the dying fire, her face troubled in the fading light. "What they're saying," she began hesitantly. "It could bring trouble, couldn't it?" Joseph settled into his chair with a heavy sigh. "People will talk. Always have, always will. But what if someone decides to—" She hugged herself, shoulders tight with worry. "What if they try to make me leave?" "No one's making you go anywhere." Joseph's voice was firm, brooking no argument. "You're safe here, no matter what whispers reach town. I gave my word to protect you, and I mean to keep it." Kira's posture relaxed slightly, though concern still shadowed her eyes. "I don't want to cause you trouble. You've done so much already." "Ain't causing trouble by being here," Joseph interrupted. "This cabin's safer with you in it. Warmer, too." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes God's plans don't match what people think proper. Reckon he knows better than they do." Surprise flickered across Kira's face at this rare mention of faith from his lips. She smiled then, small but genuine, and began to hum softly, one of the hymns that had become part of their evening ritual. Joseph leaned back in his chair, letting the familiar melody wash over him. Outside, snow continued to fall, building walls of white around their sanctuary. But inside, despite the gossip and uncertainty, peace settled over the cabin like a well-worn quilt, wrapping them in its comfortable embrace. The wooden cross caught the firelight from its new place on the shelf, casting twin shadows on the wall, one dark, one light, intertwined like the unlikely family that had formed within these sturdy walls. The days grew shorter as Christmas approached, darkness settling over the mountains by mid-afternoon. Inside Joseph's cabin, Kira had been secretly working on a special project, carefully hiding it whenever his heavy footsteps approached. She'd discovered an old trunk filled with fabric scraps, remnants of Martha's sewing projects, though Joseph never spoke of them. With patient dedication, Kira pieced together the best parts of the worn cloth, working by lamplight after Joseph had gone to sleep. Her fingers, though sometimes pricked by the needle, moved steadily as she stitched the pieces into a new shirt. It wouldn't be fancy, but it would be warm and well-made. Joseph's current shirts were threadbare in places, though he never complained. Kira measured carefully against one of his old shirts, making sure the shoulders would be broad enough and the sleeves long enough for his large frame. Christmas Eve morning dawned clear and cold. Joseph had gone out early to check his trap lines, giving Kira time to finish the last few stitches. She held up the completed shirt, examining her work with critical eyes. The fabric was mismatched in places, but she'd arranged the pieces thoughtfully, creating a pattern that looked intentional rather than makeshift. When Joseph returned, stamping snow from his boots, Kira had the shirt wrapped in a piece of clean muslin and tied with a string. She'd placed it on the table beside his usual spot, her heart beating faster as he approached. "What's this?" he asked, eyeing the package with surprise. "Merry Christmas," Kira said softly. "It's not much, but—" Joseph's large hands seemed almost hesitant as they untied the string. As the muslin fell away, he held up the shirt, his expression unreadable. Kira rushed to fill the silence. "I found some fabric in the old trunk. I hope you don't mind. I noticed your shirts were wearing thin, and I thought—" "You made this?" Joseph's voice was gruff with emotion. "For me?" Kira nodded, watching anxiously as he ran his fingers over the neat stitching. I tried to make it strong where it needs to be. For working, you see." Joseph cleared his throat. "Ain't had a Christmas gift since—" He trailed off, but Kira understood. Not since Martha. "Try it on?" she suggested gently. To her delight, he did, shrugging off his old shirt and pulling on the new one. It fit well. Her measurements had been accurate. The fabric, though pieced together from scraps, hung properly across his broad shoulders. "Fits just right," he said. And though his words were few, the warmth in his voice told Kira all she needed to know. Later that evening, as Kira stirred the venison stew bubbling over the fire, Joseph approached her with something clutched in his hand. He seemed almost nervous, a strange sight in such a large, usually confident man. "Got something for you too," he said, holding out his closed fist. When he opened it, a small silver locket lay in his palm. It was old, but well cared for, its surface gleaming in the firelight. "Oh," Kira breathed, touching it gently. "It's beautiful." "Was my mother's," Joseph explained. "Inside, well, look for yourself." Kira carefully opened the locket. Inside, engraved in tiny letters, was a Bible verse. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" "Mama's favorite scripture," Joseph said quietly. "Helped her through hard times. Thought maybe it might do the same for you." Tears pricked at Kira's eyes as she closed the locket and slipped it around her neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll treasure it always." They sat down to their Christmas Eve supper together, the table set with their best meal in weeks. The venison stew was rich with root vegetables Joseph had stored in his root cellar. Dried apples, carefully hoarded for a special occasion, provided a sweet finish. Joseph had even brought out some precious coffee, its aroma filling the cabin with warmth and comfort. As they ate, Kira shared stories of Christmases past with her family, before the hard times came. To her surprise, Joseph began to share some of his own memories, tales of his mother's cooking, his father's hunting stories, the simple joy of family gathered around a fire much like this one. Then something extraordinary happened. Kira, describing a mishap with her father's attempted Christmas turkey, saw Joseph's shoulders shake. A low, rough sound emerged, unfamiliar at first, then recognizable as laughter. Though rusty from disuse, it was genuine and warm, transforming his entire face. The sound filled the cabin, mixing with Kira's own delighted laughter. It felt right somehow, as if the cabin itself had been waiting for such moments of joy to return to its walls. As evening deepened into night, snow began to fall outside their windows. They sat by the fire, comfortable in their shared silence. Kira fingered the locket at her throat, feeling truly at home for the first time since her parents' deaths, even though she knew this peace might be temporary. Come spring, as Joseph had said, she would need to make her own way. But for now, in this moment, she belonged. The feeling was so strong it brought tears to her eyes, and she whispered a prayer of thanks, for safety, for warmth, for the gruff but kind man who had given her both. Near the hearth, Joseph bowed his head in his own prayer. The peace that filled him was something he'd thought lost forever. The peace of shared meals and quiet evenings, of having someone to care for and protect. He gave thanks for this unexpected gift, this chance to be useful again, to be more than just a solitary figure in the mountains. The snow continued falling through the night, blanketing the world in pristine white, but morning brought an unwelcome discovery. As Joseph stepped outside to fetch more firewood, his keen eyes spotted tracks in the fresh snow, bootprints that came close to the cabin windows before circling away. Someone had been watching them in the night. Joseph's body tensed, his hand automatically reaching for his rifle. The tracks were fresh, made after the heaviest snowfall. Whoever had made them couldn't have gone far. He studied the prints carefully, noting their size and depth. These weren't the tracks of a curious neighbor or lost traveler. These were the purposeful marks of someone who wanted to remain unseen, someone who had stood in the darkness peering into their Christmas celebration. Returning inside, Joseph found Kira humming as she prepared breakfast, still wearing his mother's locket. He didn't mention the tracks, not yet. But his eyes moved to the rifle above the door, and his shoulders carried the weight of renewed vigilance. The peace of Christmas night had been real, but so was the danger that lurked beyond their walls. Joseph knew that soon, perhaps too soon, they would have to face whatever threat those tracks represented. January descended on the mountains like a hungry wolf, bringing winds that howled through the pines and temperatures that froze water solid in seconds. Inside the cabin, Joseph and Kira adapted to the brutal cold, developing new routines born of necessity and caution. Joseph rose before dawn each morning, his breath visible in the freezing air as he checked the perimeter of their small clearing. The tracks they'd discovered on Christmas still haunted him, though snow had long since buried them. He chopped more firewood than ever before, stacking it high against the cabin's outer walls, partly for convenience, partly as an extra barrier against both cold and intruders. His rifle, once stored high above the door, now rested within arm's reach of his sleeping spot near the hearth. The weapon's presence was a constant reminder of the danger that lurked beyond their walls. Kira noticed these changes but didn't speak of them directly. Instead, she threw herself into learning everything she could about survival. "Teach me to set snares," she asked one morning, her face determined. "I want to help provide for us." Joseph studied her for a long moment. She was no longer the trembling girl from the saloon. 2 months of mountain living had strengthened her, though she remained slight compared to his towering frame. "Ain't easy work," he warned, "especially in deep snow." "I'm stronger than I look," Kira replied, lifting her chin. "And I need to know these things." Joseph nodded slowly. "Reckon you do." That afternoon, he taught her how to fashion snares from wire, demonstrating the proper loops and triggers. Kira's fingers, though cold, proved nimble at the delicate work. She listened intently as he explained where to place the traps, near rabbit runs and under low branches where grouse might land. "Watch how the snow lays," he instructed, pointing to subtle dips and patterns in the white expanse. "Animals make paths you can't always see straight out, but they're there if you know how to look." Kira absorbed everything, asking smart questions that showed she was thinking beyond the immediate lesson. "How far should I range from the cabin when setting them?" "Not far," Joseph answered firmly. "Never out of sight of smoke from our chimney, and always bring the rifle if I ain't with you." She nodded, understanding the unspoken warning. The wilderness held natural dangers, but it was human threats that worried them most. The next morning, Kira bundled up in layers of wool and fur to check her first snares. Joseph watched from the doorway as she made her way through knee-deep snow, moving carefully as he'd taught her. She returned an hour later, red-cheeked but triumphant with 2 plump rabbits. "Well done," Joseph said simply, but his approval made her beam with pride. As January wore on, Kira proved herself increasingly capable. She learned to split kindling with precise strokes, to read weather in the clouds, to keep the cabin's interior warm with careful management of the fire. Joseph found himself relying on her help more each day, though he remained protective. Then came the afternoon that changed everything. They were checking the spring together, a critical task as it was their only water source. Joseph had chopped through the ice that morning, and they needed to fill their barrels before night fell. The winter sun hung low, painting long shadows across the snow. Kira spotted them first, fresh hoofprints in the new-fallen snow circling the spring. "Joseph," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. He was already crouching, examining the tracks, at least 3 horses, he determined, and they'd passed through recently, within the last few hours. The riders had dismounted here, probably to water their mounts and scout the area. "Back to the cabin," he said quietly, "now." They hurried through the gathering dusk, Joseph scanning the tree line constantly. Once inside, he barred the door and checked every window shutter, making sure they were secure. Kira stood by the fire, trembling not from cold but from fear. "They found me," she said, her voice barely audible. "Just like I knew they would." Joseph turned to her, seeing the terror in her eyes. "Tell me everything," he said gently. "All of it." They sat at the rough-hewn table, lamplight casting warm shadows as Kira finally shared her full story. Her father had been a failed merchant, taking loans from increasingly dangerous men. When he died, they'd come to collect, not money, but her. "They said I was payment for his debts," she whispered, twisting the locket she still wore around her neck. "They had it all arranged. A man in Kansas City would buy me, said he owned hotels, but everyone knew what kind." She shuddered. "When my guardian lost me in that poker game, he was probably trying to raise money to pay them off." Joseph's hands clenched into fists. "No man has the right to sell another," he said, his voice rough with anger. Not ever. I ran away twice before, Kira continued. They found me both times. Said next time they'd chain me. She looked up at Joseph, eyes bright with unshed tears. I can't go back. I'd rather die in these mountains. You'll do neither, Joseph said firmly. He was silent for a long moment, then spoke words he'd held inside for years. I know something about feeling owned. About being judged and found wanting. Kira waited quietly as he gathered his thoughts. Martha, my wife, she wanted babies more than anything. We tried for years, but none came. His voice grew hoarse with remembered pain. Folks in town started whispering. Called me cursed. Said no real man would shoot blanks like that. Martha, she took sick with fever one winter. Died still praying for a child I couldn't give her. Oh, Joseph, Kira breathed, reaching across the table to touch his hand. Felt like God himself had turned his back on me, Joseph continued. Came up here to these mountains to die alone. Figured that's what I deserved. He looked at Kira, his eyes softening. Never thought he'd send me someone to protect instead. Maybe, Kira said carefully. God knew we both needed healing. You from your grief, me from my fear. Joseph was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. The lamp flickered, making shadows dance on the walls. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines like a lonely spirit. Finally, he spoke, his voice deep and certain. I make you this vow, Kira. Long as I draw breath, those men won't lay a hand on you. This cabin's your sanctuary for as long as you need it. Even if it means fighting, she asked softly. Even then, he nodded. Though I'm praying it won't come to that. Kira's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of relief rather than fear. For the first time since her father's death, she felt truly safe. The mountain man who had won her in a poker game had become more than a protector. He was the father figure she desperately needed. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. Joseph merely nodded, but his eyes were warm. He rose and checked his rifle one more time before settling on his bedroll near the fire. Kira climbed to her loft, wrapped in the quilt he'd given her. As the fire burned low, they both knew things had changed. Their arrangement was no longer temporary shelter, but a commitment to stand together against whatever threats might come. Their broken pieces, his grief, her fear, had somehow fitted together to make something stronger. Outside, snow began to fall again, covering the tracks near the spring. But Joseph and Kira remained vigilant, knowing that somewhere in the vast whiteness, men with dark intentions were watching, waiting, planning. Yet in their cabin, despite the danger, they had found something neither expected, a family forged not by blood, but by choice and circumstance, and they would defend it with everything they had. February's fury hammered the high country with relentless storms. Snow piled against the cabin walls, and bitter winds howled through the pines like hungry wolves. Inside, Joseph and Kira maintained their careful routine, stoking the fire, melting snow for water, sharing quiet meals together. The morning dawned steel, gray, and cold. Joseph stood at the window, scanning the ridgeline as he did each day. His breath frosted the glass as he peered out, but something made him pause. There, against the pale sky, a thin tendril of smoke rose from behind the ridge. Kira, he called softly, not taking his eyes from that telltale wisp. Stay inside today. Bar the door behind me. She looked up from where she was kneading bread dough, flour dusting her hands. What is it? Smoke, need to scout. He pulled on his heavy coat and checked his rifle. Remember what I taught you. Keep the shotgun close, stay away from the windows, she finished. Her voice was steady, but fear flickered in her eyes. Joseph nodded grimly. I won't be long. He moved through the deep snow with practiced stealth despite his size. Years in the mountains had taught him how to stay hidden, how to read the land. The smoke grew clearer as he approached, rising from a sheltered hollow below the ridge. Keeping to the cover of thick pines, Joseph crept forward until he could see the camp. His heart sank. 3 horses were tied near a lean-to shelter, their riders gathered around a small fire. He recognized 2 as the debt collectors who'd been asking about Kira in town. The 3rd man made his blood run cold. Sheriff Burke sat with them, his badge glinting dully in the winter light. Joseph watched long enough to confirm his fears. They were armed, rifles and pistols clearly visible, Their conversation carried faintly on the wind, fragments about collecting what's owed and doing this legal-like. The sheriff's presence changed everything. These men weren't just thugs now. They had the law's authority behind them, twisted though it might be. Joseph knew Burke's reputation for bending justice to serve whoever paid best. He made his way back to the cabin, moving faster now. Kira opened the door at his signal, face anxious. 3 of them, he said, hanging his coat by the fire. The sheriff's with them. Kira went pale. Sheriff Burke? But why would he? Money talks louder than justice to some men. Joseph checked the cabin's defenses. Windows secured, extra wood and water inside, weapons loaded. They'll likely come tonight or tomorrow. They tried to maintain normalcy through the afternoon, but tension filled the cabin like smoke. Kira's hands shook as she prepared their supper of venison stew and cornbread. Joseph cleaned his rifles methodically, checking and rechecking supplies. As they ate, Kira barely touched her food. Joseph, she said finally, maybe I should just go. Save you the trouble of... No. His voice was firm. We've had this discussion. But they have the sheriff with them now. They could arrest you or worse. She pushed her bowl away. I won't have you hurt because of me. Joseph set down his spoon, fixing her with a steady gaze. Listen close, girl. What those men plan ain't legal, badge or no badge. They mean to sell you like property. That's not justice. It's evil wearing a lawman's coat. But the scandal... Hang the scandal. He softened his tone. Kira, you asked once why I have no family. Truth is, I turned my back on everything after Martha died. My faith, my fellow man, even hope itself. But God sent you here for a reason. Maybe to remind me what it means to stand for something right. Tears spilled down Kira's cheeks. I'm not worth your life. Every soul's worth fighting for. Joseph reached across the table and took her hand. You're family now, whether you like it or not. And family stands together. As darkness fell, they cleared the dishes and prepared for what might come. Joseph positioned lanterns strategically, creating shadows that would make it hard to see inside. Kira filled buckets with water and laid out bandages, just in case. The moon rose, casting silver light on the snow. They sat together by the fire, too tense to sleep. Kira held her mother's Bible in her lap, drawing comfort from its worn pages. Would you read? Joseph asked quietly. Been too long since I heard the good book proper. Kira opened to Psalms, her voice soft but steady. The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust. As she read, Joseph closed his eyes, letting the familiar words wash over him. How many times had Martha read these same verses? The thought didn't bring pain now, but a quiet strength. The sound of horses moving through snow broke the peace. Joseph was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand. Up to the loft, he told Kira. Stay low and quiet. She clutched the Bible to her chest. Joseph, go on now. Whatever happens, remember you're worth fighting for. Kira hurried up the ladder just as someone pounded on the door. Joseph positioned himself where he could see both entrance and windows. Hale? Sheriff Burke's voice carried through the thick wood. Open up. Got business with you. Kind of late for social calls, Sheriff, Joseph called back. Got a warrant here, says different. That girl you took from town, she's wanted for questioning about her father's debts. Need to bring her in. Joseph's grip tightened on his rifle. Any warrant claiming a person as property ain't worth the paper it's written on. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Burke warned. We can do this peaceful or rough, your choice. My choice is to stand for what's right. Joseph's voice carried the weight of conviction. That girl's under my protection. Any man means her harm, better be ready to meet his maker. Silence fell outside. Joseph could picture them conferring, weighing whether he meant his threat. They'd heard the stories about him, the giant mountain man who'd survived things that would kill ordinary men. Last chance, Hale, Burke called. Open up now or we're coming in. In the loft, Kira's whispered prayers mingled with the wind. Joseph took up position beside the door, rifle ready. The storm that had been building wasn't of snow and ice, but of men's greed and corruption against one man's awakened conscience. As horses stamped in the snow and men prepared their weapons, Joseph sent up a prayer of his own. Lord, he whispered, give me strength to protect what's right, And if it comes to shooting, guide my hand true. The first impact against the door shook the cabin's walls, and the night's true storm began. The first light of dawn painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold, but Joseph found no beauty in it. His muscles ached from the night's vigil, watching every shadow for movement. The confrontation he'd expected hadn't come, a fact that worried him more than any direct assault would have. Kira descended from the loft, dark circles under her eyes betraying her own sleepless night. "Maybe they've gone," she whispered, but her voice held little hope. Joseph shook his head, checking the cabin's defenses one last time. Men like that don't give up easy. Stay alert. They tried to maintain their morning routine, Kira stirring porridge over the fire while Joseph brought in fresh water from the spring. The familiar motions felt hollow, like actors performing in a play where everyone knew the ending would be tragic. The sound came just as they were sitting down to eat, multiple horses approaching at a steady pace. No attempt at stealth this time. Joseph's hand went to his rifle, but something in the confident rhythm of the hoofbeats made his stomach knot. "Sheriff's office, open up, Hale." Burke's voice rang out stronger in the morning light. "Got papers need serving." Joseph moved to the window, keeping to one side. Through the frost-edged glass, he counted 5 men now: the sheriff, the 2 debt collectors, and 2 deputies he recognized from town. All armed, all looking grimly official. "Kira," he said quietly, "get your coat on. Whatever happens, remember, you did nothing wrong." She nodded, face pale but determined as she pulled on her worn wool coat. Joseph took a deep breath and opened the door, positioning himself in the frame so they couldn't see past him. Sheriff Burke stood at the front of the group, a document clutched in his gloved hand. His badge caught the morning light as he stepped forward. "Step aside, Hale. This is official business." "What kind of official business needs 5 armed men?" Joseph's voice was steady, though anger simmered beneath. "Got papers here saying the girl's owed his payment for her father's debts." Burke waved the document. "She's coming with us, peaceful-like or otherwise." "A person can't be owed as payment," Joseph growled. "Show me proof these debts are even real." Burke's face hardened. "Don't need to prove nothing to you. Way I hear it, you took her from town without any legal right. Some might call that kidnapping." The 2 debt collectors smirked and Joseph's hands clenched into fists. "I won her fair in that game." "Which makes it worse," Burke cut in, "gambling over a young girl, living alone with her all winter. Folks in town are talking about the immorality of it." "There's been no immorality here," Kira spoke up from behind Joseph, her voice trembling but clear. "He's protected me, given me shelter." "Step out here, girl," Burke ordered. "This isn't about what you want." Joseph shifted to block the doorway more fully. "Show me real proof of these debts. Let's take this before a proper judge." "We are the law out here," one of the debt collectors called out. "Now move aside before we move you." The deputies spread out, hands on their weapons. Joseph knew he could probably take down 2, maybe 3 before they got to him. But then what? They'd still take Kira, and he'd be dead or in jail, unable to help her at all. "Joseph," Kira touched his arm gently, "don't get yourself killed over this." Before he could respond, Burke nodded to his deputies. They rushed forward, catching Joseph off guard as they slammed into him. He staggered, trying to keep his footing in the snow, but more hands grabbed him. "No!" Kira cried out as one of the debt collectors seized her arm, dragging her outside. "Please, he never harmed me. He's a good man." Joseph fought against the hands holding him, his size working against him as they used his momentum to throw him down into a snowdrift. A boot caught him in the ribs, driving the air from his lungs. Another blow landed on his back. "Stop it!" Kira's voice cracked with tears. "You're hurting him." Through snow-blurred vision, Joseph saw them forcing her onto a horse, her struggles useless against their strength. He tried to rise, only to feel the cold press of a gun barrel against his neck. "Stay down," Burke warned. "You follow us, you'll get shot. This is your only warning." "She's just a child," Joseph gasped, spitting blood into the snow. "You know this ain't right." For just a moment, something like shame flickered across Burke's face. Then he turned away, mounting his horse. Sometimes the law ain't about right and wrong. It's about who's owed what. Joseph could only watch as they rode away, Kira's sobs fading into the morning air. The cabin door creaked in the wind, swinging open to reveal the mess inside. Chairs overturned, dishes scattered from their breakfast. Snow began to fall, soft and silent, covering the tracks of horses and men. He lay there in the drift, every breath painful, every heartbeat a reminder of his failure. The snow settled on his coat, on his face, as if nature itself were trying to bury his shame. The man who'd survived countless winters alone, who'd fought off bears and outlaws, had been helpless to protect one innocent girl. The morning light seemed to mock him now, touching the peaceful mountain peaks while below, injustice rode away unchallenged. In all his years of solitude, Joseph had never felt more alone than in this moment, stretched out in the snow, with only the creaking door and his own ragged breathing for company. The pristine white of the new fallen snow was marred by spots of his blood, bright red against the pure surface. Like his failure, it stood as a stark reminder that sometimes evil won, sometimes the strong prevailed over the right. The silence of the mountains pressed down, witness to his humiliation but offering no comfort. Joseph remained there, the cold seeping into his bones as the snow continued to fall. Each flake that touched his face felt like a tear he couldn't shed, nature's quiet mourning for justice lost, and protection failed. The open door of his cabin swung gently in the morning breeze, inviting him back to an emptiness he wasn't sure he could face. The door of Joseph's cabin groaned in the winter wind, snow drifting across the threshold. Inside, the hearth stood cold and lifeless, much like Joseph's spirit. He had managed to drag himself from the snowdrift, his body aching from the beating. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. Night fell early in the mountains and darkness crept into every corner of the cabin. Joseph sat motionless in his chair, staring at the empty place where Kira should have been. The quiet pressed against his ears like a physical weight. No soft humming of hymns, no gentle movements as she worked, no quiet prayers before bed. Just silence. Fool, he muttered to himself, the word bitter on his tongue. Thinking you could protect anyone. Thinking you deserved any kind of family. The shame that had haunted him for years rose up like bile. Memories of townspeople's whispers about his barrenness, his late wife's tears, the way people looked at him with pity or scorn. He had retreated to these mountains to escape such judgment, yet here he was, having failed again at the simple task of keeping someone safe. A gust of wind rattled the windows, and Joseph's eyes fell on Kira's few belongings, scattered in the struggle. Her worn shawl lay crumpled by the hearth. The sight of it twisted something inside him. She had been so brave, so determined to make a life here despite everything. Something glinted on the table, catching the weak moonlight that filtered through the windows. Joseph rose stiffly, his bruised muscles protesting, and moved closer. There, forgotten in the chaos, lay the locket he had given her for Christmas. His mother's scripture, sealed inside its silver walls. Joseph's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees beside the table, clutching the locket in his trembling hands. The metal was cold against his palm, like the winter that had settled into his soul. Why? The word escaped him, raw and broken. Why did you send her here if I couldn't protect her? The question hung in the air, and suddenly, like a dam-breaking, words poured from him. Years of silent anger, of buried grief, of questions never asked spilled out into the darkness. I ain't prayed proper in years, Joseph's voice cracked. Not since Sarah died. Not since you took away any chance of children, I thought. I thought you'd abandoned me to loneliness. But then you sent Kira, and for the first time in so long this cabin felt like home again. Tears he hadn't allowed himself to shed in years tracked down his weathered cheeks. She reads your word like it's precious, sings your hymns like they're joy itself. She saw good in me when I'd forgotten it was there. The locket's edges pressed into his palm as he gripped it tighter. I know I ain't worthy. Know I've turned my back on you. But please, please give me the courage to do what's right, to stand up against this evil, even if it costs me everything. Joseph's prayer faded into the darkness, but something had changed. The shame that had weighed him down began to lift, replaced by a clarity he hadn't felt in years. He looked around the cabin, seeing it through new eyes. This wasn't just about him anymore or his past failures. This was about justice, about protecting the innocent. Something he knew in his bones was God's work. Standing slowly, Joseph moved with purpose. He retrieved his rifle from where it had fallen, checking it carefully before loading it. His heavy winter coat came next, then supplies he might need: rope, dried meat, matches. His hands moved steadily, though his ribs protested each motion. The tracks would be covered by now, the snow had seen to that. But Joseph knew where they would have taken her. The sheriff's office first, most likely, then wherever those debt collectors had arranged. His jaw tightened at the thought of what they might have planned for her. As he prepared, Joseph's mind cleared. The self-pity and doubt fell away, replaced by a steel-hard resolve. He might not be a righteous man, might not be worthy of God's favor, but he could still choose to stand for what was right, could still fight for someone who needed protection. Joseph paused at the door, looking back at the cabin. The Bible Kira had read from lay open on the shelf, and he crossed back to take it, tucking it inside his coat. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone anymore. The night air bit at his face as he stepped outside. Snow was falling again, thick flakes swirling in the darkness. Joseph secured his pack and rifle, then began the long trek down the mountain toward town. Each step sent pain through his bruised body, but he welcomed it now. The pain meant he was moving, fighting back, choosing action over despair. Stars pierced the clouds overhead, cold and distant. Joseph remembered how Kira had marveled at them that first night on the trail, how she had said they reminded her that God was watching over them. He hadn't believed it then, had almost scoffed at such simple faith. Now, though, those same stars seemed to light his path, guiding him toward whatever justice he could find. The wind carried the lonely cry of a wolf somewhere in the darkness. Joseph pulled his coat tighter and pressed on. The town lay miles below, through deep snow and dangerous terrain. But distance meant nothing now. He would walk through hell itself if that's what it took to make things right. "Hold on, child," he whispered into the night. "I'm coming." The words felt like a prayer, like a promise both to Kira and to God. He had failed once through inaction, through letting his fears and doubts rule him. That time was over. Whatever came next, jail, bullets, or worse. He would face it standing tall, fighting for what he knew was right. The locket rested against his chest, tucked safely in an inner pocket. Its presence reminded him of everything at stake: innocence, justice, faith itself. The same scripture that had comforted his mother now drove him forward, step by painful step, down the snowy mountain toward whatever dawn might bring. Behind him, his cabin grew small in the darkness, a lone point of shelter in the vast wilderness. But Joseph didn't look back. His path lay ahead, through the swirling snow and bitter wind, toward a town that had scorned him and men who had beaten him, toward a chance at redemption, not just for Kira, but for his own soul as well. The night deepened around him as he made his way down the familiar trail. Each step was a prayer, each breath a commitment. He had found his faith again in the darkness of loss, and now that faith would light his way through whatever trials lay ahead. Snow continued to fall, erasing his tracks almost as soon as he made them. But Joseph pressed on, one foot after another, moving with the steady determination that had kept him alive through countless mountain winters. This time, though, he moved not just to survive, but to save, not just to exist, but to truly live again, as God had meant him to. The path before him vanished into darkness, but Joseph's heart was finally clear. Whatever came next, he would face it standing firm in his renewed faith, fighting for justice with every breath he had left. The night was long, but dawn would come, and with it the chance to make things right. Dawn painted the eastern peaks in pale gold as Joseph made his way down the mountain trail. Each step sent pain through his bruised ribs, but he pressed forward, driven by purpose. The familiar path to Leadville stretched before him, winding through stands of pine and past granite outcrops dusted with snow. By mid-morning, smoke from cooking fires caught his attention. A Ute camp lay nestled in a protected hollow just off the trail. Joseph paused, remembering the scout who had helped him years ago when he first settled in these mountains. Perhaps Henry Two Feathers still camped in these parts. As Joseph approached the camp, several women looked up from their work, their faces guarded. A tall figure emerged from one of the lodges. Henry Two Feathers himself, older now, but still straight-backed and keen-eyed. "Joseph Hale," Henry said, his voice measured. "Many moons since you traded here." Joseph nodded respectfully. "Henry, I remember the winter you showed me where to find beaver when my traps were empty. You saved my life that season. I remember also when you spoke truth about the broken treaty, stood with my people against false claims." Henry studied Joseph's battered face. You carry trouble now. A girl was taken, Joseph said, his voice rough. Kira. Men claim she's payment for her father's debts. They mean to sell her, Henry. It ain't right. Henry's dark eyes narrowed. Such things poison the land, make all people smaller. He gestured for Joseph to sit near the fire. A woman brought them cups of strong tea. Joseph's hands trembled slightly as he accepted the drink. I need witnesses who'll speak truth before the judge. Folk who'll say I protected her, never harmed her. Your word carries weight, Henry. You've known me 15 years. Henry was silent for a long moment watching the fire. Finally, he spoke. You showed honor when others did not. Kept your word when treaties turned to dust. He met Joseph's gaze. I will speak. Truth must stand against darkness. Relief flooded through Joseph. Much obliged, Henry, truly. Rest here, Henry said. Eat. Then we walked together. Joseph accepted the offer gratefully. While he ate the hearty stew Henry's wife provided, the scout gathered his weapons and supplies. An hour later, they set out together down the trail to Leadville. As they walked, Henry spoke of changes in the territory. New settlers pushing into valleys, more broken promises from the government. Joseph listened, hearing the deep hurt beneath the measured words. Both men understood what it meant to be judged unfairly, to be pushed aside by those who claimed power. By early afternoon, they reached the small church that stood on the outskirts of town. Joseph had avoided it for years, the sight of its weathered cross bringing too many painful memories. But now, he squared his shoulders and approached the door. Preacher Matthews was inside, his white hair catching the light from the stained glass windows as he arranged hymnals in the pews. He looked up as Joseph entered, recognition and surprise crossing his aged face. Joseph Hale, the preacher said softly. It's been a long time, son. Since Sarah's funeral, Joseph admitted, his throat tight. I know I ain't been right with God since then, but I need your help, preacher. The old man gestured to a pew and Joseph sat, Henry taking a place nearby. Joseph told the whole story, the poker game, protecting Kira, the months at his cabin, and finally the violent taking. As he spoke, the preacher's face grew grave. I remember when you and Sarah first came to town, Matthews said when Joseph finished. Such hope in both your eyes. Her death near destroyed you, son. But now I hear life in your voice again. This girl brought you back to faith? She reminded me what it means to trust God, Joseph said. To believe in something bigger than my own pain. I can't let them harm her, preacher. It ain't right. The old man nodded slowly. No, it ain't right at all. He stood, reaching for his coat. I conducted Sarah's funeral. I've known you 20 years, Joseph. I'll testify to your character before any judge in this territory. Hope began to grow in Joseph's chest. With Henry and Preacher Matthews standing with him, perhaps the judge would listen. Perhaps justice could still prevail. The three men walked into Leadville together as afternoon shadows lengthened across the street. Heads turned as they passed. Joseph heard the whispers start. The giant was back, and not alone. Word spread quickly in a small town. Henry walked with the fluid grace of a hunter, alert to every movement around them. Preacher Matthews moved more slowly, but his presence lent gravity to their purpose. And Joseph, though still bruised and weary, felt strength flowing back into his spirit with each step. They made their way to the saloon where it had all started. The same smoky interior, the same rough crowd, but Joseph was different now. He stood straighter, his voice carried clear and strong as he addressed the bartender. Tell Judge Wilson I need to see him, Joseph said. Tell him Henry Two Feathers and Preacher Matthews stand as witnesses. Tell him it's about justice for an innocent girl. The bartender hurried out and a hush fell over the saloon. Joseph waited, Henry and Matthews flanking him. He fingered the locket in his pocket, drawing courage from its presence. Whatever came next, he would face it with truth and faith on his side. Minutes stretched like hours. Then the saloon doors swung open and Judge Wilson entered, his face stern beneath his gray mustache. He surveyed the scene, the mountain man, the native scout, the preacher, and something in his eyes showed he understood this was no ordinary dispute. Mr. Hale, the judge said formally, I hear you wish to convene a hearing? Yes, sir, Joseph replied. About Kira Dawson, and about what's right in the eyes of God and man. Wilson nodded slowly. Very well, we'll convene at my office in 1 hour. Bring your witnesses. He turned to go, then paused. And Mr. Hale? I hope you understand what you're starting here. I do, Your Honor, Joseph said firmly. Been understanding it since the night I won that poker game. Some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. The judge left and the whispers in the saloon grew louder, but Joseph stood unmoved, Henry's quiet strength on one side, Matthew's moral authority on the other. The first step toward justice had been taken. Outside, the winter sun was sinking toward the mountains. Joseph looked west toward his cabin, remembering Kira's hymns filling the empty spaces, her quiet strength as she learned to survive in his world. He had promised to protect her, and though he had failed once, he would not fail again. We have 1 hour, Preacher Matthews said. Let us pray for wisdom and courage. Joseph bowed his head, letting the old man's words wash over him. Henry stood in respectful silence, his own prayers rising to the Creator in his native tongue. In that moment, 3 very different men were united in a single purpose: to see justice done, to protect the innocent, to stand against the darkness that would treat a human soul as property. The late afternoon light slanted through the saloon windows, painting copper and gold across the rough wooden floor. Joseph felt the weight of what was to come, but he was ready now. The time for doubt was past. The hour of justice was at hand. Henry's quiet voice broke the silence. The path is clear, he said. We walk it together. Joseph nodded, grateful beyond words for these allies who had chosen to stand with him. Whatever the outcome of the hearing, he was no longer alone in his fight. Faith, friendship, and the courage to face whatever came, these would light their way forward. The hour began to count down as they prepared for the hearing that would determine not just Kira's fate, but the very nature of justice in their corner of the frontier. Joseph's prayer was simple now, for strength to speak truth, and wisdom to see it prevail. The saloon transformed into an impromptu courtroom, tables pushed aside to make room for Judge Wilson's makeshift bench. Afternoon light filtered through dusty windows as townsfolk packed the room, their whispers filling the air like angry wasps. Sheriff Burke stood with the debt collectors, waving papers that claimed ownership of Kira. These documents show she's payment for her father's debts, Your Honor, he declared, his voice carrying across the crowded room. Judge Wilson studied the papers, his brow furrowed. Around them, townspeople muttered about scandal and impropriety, casting dark glances at Joseph. Joseph rose slowly to his full height, his voice quiet but firm. By God's law, no person can be owned, he said. Kira is free, as all God's children are free. Those papers cannot bind her soul. Henry Two Feathers stepped forward, his dignified presence commanding attention. I have known Joseph Hale for many seasons, he testified. His word is strong as mountain stone. He protects, not claims. Preacher Matthews spoke next, telling of Joseph's years of honest dealings and faithful character before grief drove him to solitude. Then Kira stood, her hands trembling but her voice clear. Joseph Hale gave me dignity when others would sell it, she declared. He never claimed me as wife, only offered shelter as family would. He taught me to stand tall again. Her words hung in the air. The room fell silent, hard heart softening under the weight of truth. Judge Wilson cleared his throat. These papers, he announced, are fraudulent. The claim is struck down. He banged his gavel as Kira's pursuers slunk toward the door, defeated by justice and truth. Outside the saloon, the late winter sun painted Leadville's muddy street with golden light. Joseph and Kira descended the wooden steps together, their boots creaking against weather-worn boards. Townsfolk gathered in small clusters, their whispers carrying on the crisp mountain air, but now their words held a different tone, one of respect, though some still cast doubtful glances. Kira's hand found Joseph's arm, her grip firm and sure. I want to stay with you, she announced, loud enough for those nearby to hear. Not as a wife, but as family, until the day comes when I choose my own path. Joseph's weathered face softened. The shame that had haunted him for so long, his inability to father children, the cruel jokes about his barrenness, seemed to lift like morning mist. He understood now what God had shaped him to be. A protector, a brother in faith, a father in spirit to those who needed shelter. "Reckon that'd be just fine," he replied, his deep voice gentle. That evening, their cabin welcomed them home with familiar comfort. Kira moved about the kitchen, preparing a simple supper of cornbread and beans. The rhythmic thunk of Joseph's axe split the mountain quiet as he chopped wood outside. When the meal was ready, they sat together at the rough-hewn table, bowing their heads in gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," Joseph prayed, his voice rough with emotion, "for showing us that family ain't always about blood, but about the hearts you bind together." The mountain snows retreated inch by inch, releasing their grip on the high country. Tiny streams trickled down rocky slopes, feeding the awakening earth. Spring crept into the valleys with tender green shoots and the first brave wildflowers. Word traveled through Leadville and beyond. Joseph Hale's cabin had become a sanctuary for those with nowhere else to turn. One evening, as the sun painted the western peaks gold, hoofbeats approached. A weary woman and her young son, their clothes dusty from the trail, stopped at Joseph's gate. Her eyes held worry, his heritage clear in his Apache features. "Town wouldn't take us in," she explained softly. Joseph stepped aside, gesturing them toward the warmth within. "Welcome," he said simply. Kira was already stirring the stew pot, adding more water to stretch the meal. She smiled at the boy, remembering her own first night of refuge here. Soon they gathered around the table, steam rising from tin bowls. The widow's son watched everything with careful eyes until Kira started humming a familiar hymn. Other voices joined, filling the cabin with harmony. Joseph sat quietly, watching. Where once he'd known only the ache of being childless, now he saw the family God had built, not of blood, but of broken pieces made whole. His heart lifted in silent gratitude, not for what he'd been denied, but for what had been restored. Faith, purpose, and the dignity of offering shelter to those who needed it most. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.